So Joe Biden's proposed changes to the tax system are likely going to impact you whether you are a high income earner or not. And in yesterday's video, we broke down exactly what those changes are going to be. Now, in today's video, we're going to dive into what implications those have on the economy as a whole and on you as an individual. So let's dive right on into it. So I want to start off by talking about the history of taxes under Trump. And I don't want to make this a political statement at all. I'm going to try to keep my biases out of this, but under Trump, there was a history of cutting taxes. I mean, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was kind of the cornerstone of that. And the objective, one of the main objectives of this bill, was to spur economic growth. I mean, that's generally one of the reasons why people cut taxes. They want to spur economic growth. And for the most part, I would argue that it wasn't very effective at doing that. And so looking at kind of the metrics, when people think about, okay, cutting taxes, we want to see more money invested into more jobs, into GDP growth growing. We want to see lower unemployment. Like, these are the metrics that we're kind of looking at in terms of assessing, at least for me, assessing whether or not cutting taxes was effective. And really with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, looking at the 2 years after, so 2018, 2019, this thing was passed in 2017. So looking at data from 2018 and 2019, really the only conclusive and statistically significant impacts that this bill had, there were two things basically that happened. Okay, the first of which is that executives at large companies were paid slightly more, okay? Because with more money in their pockets, these companies could give out more stock options, could give out more compensation to their top executives, okay? Like, think C-suite people. So that was thing number one. Thing number two was a lot more share buybacks, okay? So a lot of companies were taking this additional profit that they had because they weren't paying as much in taxes and pumping it back into buying back more shares of their stock. Now, this is good for the markets, okay? Because it means stock prices go up. When share buybacks happen, stock prices tend to go up. But it's not really that great for the everyday investor and the average person. I mean, you could argue that, okay, well, with people's 401k accounts and with their IRAs, it's going to help them. But when you look at the numbers, I mean, in 2018, for example, about 70% of capital gains went to the top 1% of income earners. Okay, so when stock prices go up and there's capital gains taking place, it's not the everyday person who's taking advantage of that for the most part, okay? Because the benefits are largely being reaped by the people at the top. So I would argue, okay, I could be completely wrong. You could comment below if you think I'm completely wrong on this, but I would argue that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act largely favored higher income earners because it increased executive compensation and drove up stock prices. Now, looking at things like GDP growth, I mean, I would argue if GDP growth is going up, that generally is a tide that lifts all boats. But there really wasn't much of that on the statistically significant level. Didn't happen on a just kind of eyeballing it level. We can look at, let's see, 2018. It was slightly up. Okay, we were slightly above 3%. We're generally shooting for about 3% on GDP growth. So 2018, we were slightly over that. 2019, we were back down to pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act levels. And we really haven't seen, I mean, now we've got the whole Kombucha 19 thing, so we're not seeing much GDP growth there. But even before that in 2019, we weren't seeing the GDP growth that this bill originally promised. So I would argue that that's kind of where we're coming in at. Now, I'm not saying that to say that Biden's plan is necessarily going to be better. I'm just kind of saying that to set the stage for where has taxes kind of been in the world, or in the US, I guess, in the last couple of years. Okay, so we've got that as kind of the backdrop. Again, if you think I'm totally off on that, let me know in the comments below, because I could be totally off on that. I'm totally open to new opinion. So now let's take a look at what Biden wants to do. And you've probably heard his talking points, so I'm not going to recite those for you right now. But his number one priority is getting Kombucha 19 under control. Okay, he wants to get this under control and then move on to his other priorities that he's been talking about for the last who knows how many years, okay? So Kombucha 19, number one priority here, okay? And how he wants to do that is investing in significant widespread testing. So basically, he wants to take the Kombucha 19, how we've been handling that from kind of the state level, because Trump has really just delegated most of the stuff to the states. And he's like, okay, states, you take control of this, you figure it out. But what Biden wants to do is he wants to bring it to the federal level, and that includes kind of like a three-pronged approach. Okay, so thing number one is significant improvements in widespread testing. So putting together the resources to get widespread testing at places of work and schools, primarily places where people are showing up every single day, getting people testing as frequently as they needed, whether it's weekly, whether it's daily, just getting people the testing that they need. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is putting together a federally run contact tracing program. So hiring, I mean, he stated 100,000 people to run this contact tracing program where people who test positive, they're basically contact tracing who was that person in contact with, contacting those people, and kind of letting them know what's up. And then the third prong is potentially another round of stimulus. So the Democrats have been trying to push something through there. Mitch McConnell has not been having much of that. So that's kind of the third prong. And so once these things are put in place, then Biden will move on to the tax changes that we talked about yesterday. Okay, he's not trying to rush into those any faster than he needs to. He wants to address kombucha 19 first. Now, I want to preface this by saying that all of the stuff that I mentioned yesterday is kind of Mitch McConnell has to sign off on it, basically. Okay, so all of this stuff has to go through the Senate. All of this stuff has to go through Mitch McConnell. And that could potentially be problematic for Biden to actually get these things passed the way he has them written, okay? Because there's likely going to have to be quite a bit of compromise. And in the past, there's been a little bit of a history of Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell working together as senators, but on this level, there's likely going to have to be a lot of compromise going on between these two people to get these things passed, which means they're probably not going through exactly the way that they're written. Biden's going to have to make some concessions. McConnell's going to have to make some concessions, and we're probably going to find a happy medium, or nothing's going to happen for 2 years. Like, that's totally a possibility as well. But I'm kind of optimistic that we'll be able to work something out where it's kind of a happy medium for both people. So that's kind of the caveat, because these projections, according to the Tax Foundation, rely on the way that it's written right now. Okay, so it's probably not going to go through the way it's written right now, but if it did go through the way it's written right now, this is kind of the impact that it would have. Okay, so big picture, $3 trillion in government revenue is kind of what the prediction is for what we would see if these changes went through over a 10-year span. Okay, so we're looking at roughly $300 million a year for 10 years is roughly what would be generated from the tax changes that are proposed. Now, that's it's less than the deficit that we ran up in 2020 already over 10 years. So obviously, if we do want to make a dent on the deficit, which isn't a number one priority for anyone, but if they did, these taxes would have to go up significantly, either affecting more people or cutting deeper into the people that they're currently affecting. But like I said, cutting the deficit isn't really anyone's number one priority, and these taxes would primarily be used for the things that Joe Biden's been using as his talking points for the last however many years. So things like fighting climate change, fighting inequality, and investing into widespread education across the United States. Now, Joe Biden's got plans written up on these three things, as well as plenty of other things, to spend over $11 trillion. This tax situation that he's got proposed only raises 3. So you've got 3 trillion over here, you've got 11 trillion that he's talking about spending. So you got to kind of meet that somewhere. And I mean, you could just raise the deficit even more, but we'll kind of see if that's the route that they want to go down. So the bulk of federal revenues, just for some context here, about 50% of federal revenues as a whole federal government comes from individual income taxes. Okay, like this is the moneymaker for the government, is individual income taxes. And the bulk of that comes from the middle and upper middle class, because that's where a lot of people are located, and a lot of those people are paying a decent amount in taxes. When you get super high up there, you've got more advanced strategies for people to pay less of their income in taxes. At the very low end, people aren't even paying taxes. So like the middle bit is kind of where a lot of that juice is to be squeezed. And with Joe Biden's plan, they're really going after the very top, okay? So personally, I think it's possible as time goes on that the squeeze goes from the very top and works its way kind of down to the upper middle and middle class, because if he's trying to spend $11 trillion and he's only getting 3, like I think it's gonna have to work its way down eventually, because I think there's only so hard you can squeeze the top without getting some serious pushback. So I think things are gonna kind of work their way down the line as time goes on here with these plans. But again, that's just personal speculation. So as far as the impacts of these changes, okay, what we're likely to see, three main things. Okay, we're likely to see GDP fall, we're likely to see overall jobs fall, and we're likely to see wages fall. Okay, those are the 3 big things that we're looking at here. And that's kind of due to the cyclical nature of the economy. That's kind of how things work, okay? Like if we keep cutting taxes and raising the deficit higher and higher, eventually there's going to be a problem there, because we're taking on more debt and we're not collecting more revenue. Now, it's totally open for debate where that point is. I think we're quite a ways away from that, given how low interest rates are at the moment and given the current state of the world. I think we can definitely afford to be at a deficit for a decent while longer, but some people would argue that we do need to take that into account relatively soon. But bottom line there is just that at a point, there is too much debt, and you need to address that issue. You can't just be at a deficit for infinity. So eventually that needs to be addressed. Probably not in the short term, but eventually it is something to consider. So in terms of numbers for the changes for the Biden tax plan, okay, the Tax Foundation, which is a nonpartisan organization, comes up with the following estimates. Okay, so first estimate, GDP is going to be down 1.62% is their estimate there. And that's really due to something called deadweight loss. Okay, so basically whenever the government steps into a market, there is some inefficiencies, okay? Because theoretically, if the market was just free to do its own thing, it would come to equilibrium and supply and demand would kind of come together. But whenever the government steps in, there's going to be some inefficiencies there. And so that's why GDP would fall if this plan were to go into account, because the government stepping in collecting revenue, that's going to be an inefficiency. Now, additionally, 542,000 jobs are estimated to be lost as a result of this, and with that comes wages falling about 1.15%. Now, the reason that these two things would happen is because of the corporate tax rate, largely because of the corporate tax rate going up. And whenever the corporate tax rate goes up, workers tend to bear a little bit of that themselves, because the corporation doesn't want to bear all of that on their own. So what they're going to do is they're going to reduce salaries. They're not going to give out raises as often. And it's just going to be a bit of a squeeze on the workers that work there. And then in terms of the jobs, I mean, like if they're not making as much money, they can't afford to hire as many people. And so that's where the jobs are going, basically. On an individual level, top 1% earners are likely to see 11.3% fall in their after-tax income. So this is pretty significant, okay? If you're in the top 1%, seeing over 10% of your after-tax income falling is a pretty significant squeeze that is being put on them. So this, I mean, likely is not going to go through the way that it stands right now, just because of how much that would be putting pressure on the top 1%, and Mitch McConnell probably wouldn't really go for that, but that's how it stands right now. The top 5% would see a 1.3% fall in their income after tax. So as you can see, like it's really hitting the 1% hard, and then top 5% a little bit, and then once you get past the top 5%, you're really not seeing much of an impact at all. Again, like I said, other than the wages falling a little bit. Now, the lower you go, eventually you start seeing people who are better off because of the tax credits that are included here, including the child tax credit, child care tax credit. The expansion of those credits is actually making those lower income folks better off. So moral of the story is that as it stands right now, we'd see GDP falling a bit. I mean, that's a decently significant fall right there. A good number of jobs lost, as well as wages falling, not very significantly. Okay, so that is all dependent on this going through as it stands, which, like I said, I don't think is very likely. But that's just kind of the projected impacts that the current Biden tax plan would have on the economy as a whole. Now, the next thing you should do is click the subscribe button down below and then check out this video over here, which I can't quite tell what it is. I don't have my glasses on, but I'm sure you're going to enjoy it nonetheless.